My name is Jacob Nolan. I was 27, and on October 12th, 2019, something happened on a lonely stretch of highway that I still can't explain. What would you do if every mile you drove felt like leaving the world you knew behind? Would you keep driving or turn back? I want you to meet the people who mattered that night before I tell you exactly what unfolded. There's no moralizing here, just names, faces, and the way small choices stack into something dangerous. I'd been planning a 3-day road trip from Asheville to a music festival in northern Ohio. I'd taken long drives before. I loved highways where radio stations bled into each other and coffee shops looked like movie sets. I wasn't reckless. I was careful in the way someone who's been alive long enough to lose a few things becomes careful, attentive to the subtle hums, the odd smells, the tiny things that warn you. My friend who convinced me to go was Marcus Hale, 31, a mechanic with a crooked grin and a laugh that made any dark bar feel like home. Marcus always insisted on the stereo loud enough to make your chest vibrate. He'd fixed my truck's brake light the week before and told me, "Roads test you differently at night." He meant the road in the practical sense. He didn't know how right he'd been. There was Mimi Lawson, 26, a freelance photographer with a black backpack full of lenses and an appetite for abandoned places. She loved the uncanny. Shutter clicks in empty schools, portraits of rust. Her presence turned mundane rest stops into eerie art sets. She insisted the festival would be a great chance to shoot musicians at dawn. And then there was Danny Whitlow, 29, who worked night shifts at a hospital and came on the trip to escape fluorescent lights. Danny's calm made other people confident. He was the one who brought snacks and a first aid kit in a nondescript tin. He'd been my friend since college, the kind you called at 3 a.m. because he actually answered. We left on a cool October morning with the truck packed. Sleeping bags, coffee thermos, camera gear, and band t-shirts. The route we chose hugged old state roads because Marcus hated interstates. Too impersonal, he said. That choice would thread us through stretches locals called by names I'd never heard. Cedar Hollow, Mill Pond Road, and a state route that cut across farmland and pines. The first day was perfect in the way memory paints the beginning of anything. Songs on repeat, snacks crinkling, some debate about who'd seen the better sunrise shot so far. I want to be honest about why we were together. It wasn't just the festival. Marcus was chasing a break from a rough breakup. Mimi was chasing new frames for her portfolio. Danny was chasing normalcy after long weeks of the hospital. I was chasing the easy thrill of leaving a city for a weekend. That mixture, wounded, restless, hungry, made us vulnerable in ways we didn't notice until later. The conversations were raw and light. Bar arguments, old girlfriends, the best sandwich in town. We egged each other on. We traded dares. On a map, our little caravan was just a dot moving northeast. In reality, the dot had edges we would later wish we'd seen. The second day, the weather turned. We'd missed the main highway to take a back road. Marcus swore by, a scenic 2-lane that clipped river bends and passed through a town called Pinecrest. Pinecrest looked like a place that time forgot. A single stoplight, a diner with a handwritten chalkboard daily special, and porches where old men watched the road. We stopped for gas. The cashier at the station, a woman around 60 with thin hair and a voice like dry paper, warned us not about the weather, but about a stretch ahead called Hollow Ridge. "Not much sell," she said, and then, softer, "Pay attention." We waved the warning off as locals do when they think you're not from around there. It was late afternoon when we rolled onto Hollow Ridge, the sun slanting low. The trees converged overhead like a tunnel, and the air smelled of pine sap and damp earth. The radio fuzzed and cycled through country and an old rock station. As we drove, shadows bent across the road and then flattened. The truck's headlights cut lanes through the dusk. For a while, it was cinematic, the perfect backdrop for Mimi's photos as she snapped from the passenger seat. I'll stop here with the setup and tell you this plainly. Everything that followed hinged on one intersection, one wrong turn, and one person's decision to keep going when every sensible instinct said to stop. We thought we were safe because we had each other. We thought the road would lead us where roads always lead, to towns, to help, to the festival. None of that was wrong until it was. Now, and this is where I go into the part that keeps me awake, the real night begins. It was after 9 p.m. when the sky had emptied into a blind, starless black. We drove past a rusted farm gate and a sign half buried in brambles that read Willow Brook, the letters peeling. The GPS started acting like a fickle friend, blinking, recalculating every few minutes as if it didn't want to commit. My phone had one bar. Marcus was behind the wheel, tired but steady. Danny had fallen asleep against the window. Mimi was scrolling photos and muttering about composition. Then, almost without warning, the truck shuddered once and the dashboard lights dipped. Marcus cursed under his breath and pulled over onto a gravel pullout beneath a hulking pine. We stepped out into a silence so thick it felt physical. No insects, no distant hum of traffic, only the faint river behind us and the truck's engine sighing to a stop. Marcus popped the hood. The engine didn't give us answers, only a smell, hot plastic and something like ozone. We were 2 hours from the nearest town by the GPS estimate. That estimate now narrated in the cold, factual voice of a machine. We had flares, a spare, and Marcus's toolbox, but no cell signal that could be trusted. The nearest farmhouse, Marcus said, was a mile down a lane that looked more like an animal trail. He volunteered to walk, claiming he could borrow a phone. He left with a pocket flashlight and an optimistic nod. The rest of us stayed behind, jokes dissolving into cigarettes and the kind of nervous laughter that presses the lips together. An hour passed. The moon bled out behind low clouds. Marcus didn't return. We thought at first he'd found a phone and gone ahead to bring help. We told ourselves stories to keep the creeping worry at bay. Then a sound came that didn't belong to the night. A vehicle, low, old, and slow, thudding up the ridge toward our parked truck. Headlights swung across the trees like searching arms. Relief flooded me stupidly into my chest. That relief turned to something colder when the vehicle stopped and a man stepped out who was not the neighborly farmer we'd expected. He was tall in a way that made him look longer than a person should. His eyes were sharp under a cap, and he moved as if he knew the land like the back of his hand. "You folks need help?" he asked, voice smooth as mud. He said his name was Boone, a name that felt like it came from a legend, and he lived just up the road. He said he'd watch our truck while Marcus was away. We let him, because what else do you do when a stranger offers help on a dark road? If only we'd remembered the gas station woman's voice. Pay attention. We didn't register the way Boone's smile stopped at the edges, like a picture frame too small. We didn't notice the way his shadow never quite matched his body. I'll tell you what happened next, but you have to understand the shape of that night first. Friends, fatigue, and small choices weaving tighter until there was no room left for a clean undo. When Marcus finally came back, and the memory of how he came back sits with me now like a splinter, it would be the first of many wrong answers to things that asked for the right one. What happened after Marcus returned is the part of the story where ordinary life fractures. It's the part I won't ever forget, and the part I owe you in full. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. Have you ever driven so far from home that the map felt like a dare, and the radio became your only honest companion? That question still sits in my chest like a pebble I swallowed and never digested. My name is Ethan Hale, I'm 31, and this happened on October 12th, 2019. I shouldn't be telling you this because part of me swore I'd never go back to that stretch of Route 84 outside Dalton Springs, but here I am, because a story that sticks to your bones needs to be told, even if the bones tremble while you tell it. People who knew me then would call me a planner. I worked as a graphic designer in Raleigh, loved old road maps, and had a habit of collecting postcards from every small town I passed through. The trip started as something ordinary. A long weekend, a friend's invitation, a busted pickup with room for one, and enough caffeine to make the highway glow. My friend's name was Luke Benton, tall, easy laugh, and the kind of guy who could talk his way out of any trouble. He was the one who pitched the idea. A 2-day drive to Lake Brantley, a fishing cabin he'd found through a coworker in the tiny town of Cedar Hollow. "It's off the beaten path," he said. "Exactly what you need, man." There were 2 others in the plan at first. Mark Donovan, who loved corny jokes and had a camera glued to his hand, and Aaron Fielding, a quieter guy who could fall asleep anywhere. Mark backed out last minute. "Family emergency," he texted, and Aaron had to work. That left Luke and me, the perfect recipe for trouble. One impulsive friend and one careful idiot, that was me. We filled Luke's truck with sleeping bags, a cooler, and playlists curated to drown out loneliness. The weather app promised clear skies. The map said 3 hours in a line between us and peace. Cedar Hollow was the kind of place with one stoplight, a diner that tasted like nostalgia, and a faded mural of a fish on the community center. The locals looked at us with curiosity reserved for tourists who carry flashlights in their glove compartments like talismans. We parked at the only gas station and asked the attendant, Miss June, a woman with a voice like warm molasses, about the cabin. She raised an eyebrow, pointed to a gravel road, and said, "Take Hollow Ridge till you see the old mile marker with the scratch. Don't go after dark." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. We laughed it off. Warnings, after all, are just another flavor of the road. Before we drove out, Luke told stories about the place, how the owner, a retired teacher named Walter Klein, left it to let strangers find themselves. He described the lake at dawn, fog lifting like someone had peeled back a sheet. I believed him because I wanted to believe in perfect sunrises and the small redemption that comes from escaping city noise. I packed a notebook with sketches and ideas, thinking about the video I'd make later for my channel. 2 friends, 1 road. Total freedom. It felt cinematic. We hit Hollow Ridge in the late afternoon. The gravel crunched like popcorn under the tires. Trees leaned in, making a green tunnel, and everything smelled like pine and cold earth. The road narrowed until it wasn't much more than a track. At about the 7-mile mark, there was that mile marker Miss June described, a weathered post with a deep gouge like an old wound. We slowed. Luke pointed, proud, like we'd reached a treasure. We turned left where an unmarked path led toward the lake. On the surface, nothing felt wrong. The cabin sat back from the water, wood darkened with age but sturdy. Walter's place was the sort that made you imagine 100 peaceful weekends. We unloaded, opened beers, and watched the sun fold itself behind the trees. The plan was simple. Sleep, fish at dawn, return Sunday. But plans are a paper bridge over a river that sometimes runs swifter than you suppose. For the first several hours, we did everything a Saturday night should include. Canned chili heated on an old stove, laughter that echoed against the rafters, and a small, harmless competition about who knew the worst road trip playlist. Every now and then, I'd notice things not lining up. A single shoe by the porch with no pair, a rocking chair on the far side of the porch that hadn't moved for years, and an old radio on a shelf that looked like it hadn't been touched since the 80s. Luke shrugged at these details. "All part of the charm," he said. I wanted to agree. This is where the story slows down to explain things you'll need later, about the road itself, the people we met, the way small places hold big silences. Cedar Hollow was a town with tiny grudges and older memories. People smile, but tuck away what they don't want outsiders to know. Walter Klein, the owner of the cabin, had been a teacher at the elementary for decades. He was said to have lost his wife in the late 90s and shut himself off to the world. Folks in town talked in measured sentences when his name came up. Respect, pity, and something else that was harder to name. That something else is the sort of thing that settles into your hair and becomes your smell after you leave a place. I should also tell you about the timing. October evenings in that county get darker faster than you'd expect. The sun drops like a coin and the cold arrives without apology. The combination of our late arrival and the thick tree cover meant we were isolated sooner than we planned. We had cell service only sporadically, enough to send a photo of the cabin to my sister and get one-word replies. Our only real connection to the town was Miss June's warning, which had gone unheeded in the way you ignore a foggy memory. You'll notice, as I did, how quickly peace can fold into unease once you start paying attention. Little things acquire new meanings. Footsteps when the others are asleep, a song on the radio scraping static at the same lyric, shadows that twitch like fish. I'm telling you all this because when something happens, you'll want to say, of course there were signs. There were signs, but signs are puzzles you only see when the picture is complete. We settled in for the night, lights off except for the fireplace. Luke caught me sketching the porch and asked if I was nervous. I lied. By midnight, the house was a gentle ship creaking in its sleep. Luke fell asleep on the couch. I took the futon in the spare room. Sometime after 2 a.m., I woke to the oddest sound, a low, rhythmic tapping like someone fingering the windowsill in Morse code. It was distant, and part of me imagined it was just the wood settling. But then it shifted, became steps on gravel, pausing, then moving away. I lay there, breath shallow, counting down seconds until the sound stopped. It didn't stop. It came back, and this time, closer. Now the story gets harder to tell because memory blurs into instincts. The main piece begins in the cold slice of night, when ordinary choices curdle into survival. I'll tell you what I saw, what I heard, and the mistake that almost cost us everything. The rest is what I am still afraid to think about. We heard soft knocking at the front door, 3 polite knocks, slow and deliberate. Luke, half asleep, Nash muttered and shuffled to answer. We both expected a neighbor or perhaps a late traveler lost on the way to the lake. When Luke opened the door, a thin man stood in the porch light, soaked to the skin though it hadn't rained. His jacket was patched, his eyes too bright. He didn't look like someone from Cedar Hollow. He looked like someone who had been carrying his own weather with him. "Evening?" he said. His voice was odd, flat, as if he were trying to remember how to sound normal. "Sorry to bother. My car, out on Hollow Ridge, won't start. You got a phone?" Luke offered his phone without thinking. The man's hands trembled, and when he reached for the phone, Luke noticed the smell, oil and something metallic. The man asked directions, not to the nearest town, but to a place called Old Mill Road, which wasn't far from the mile marker. Luke said he'd come with him and check the car. I objected, said we should call Miss June, but Luke waved me off. The classic mistake of hospitality and testosterone on a road trip. We left the door unlocked. Walking back to the truck under a sky that felt like it could swallow sound, all 3 of us, me, Luke, and the stranger, fell into a rhythm of footsteps on gravel. The stranger kept glancing over his shoulder. He kept saying the same odd phrase, "They don't like when you leave things behind." I asked him to explain and got no answer, only a stare that felt like a dare. At the truck, nothing. No car, no headlight, just an imprint in the gravel and a fresh scent of oil. We turned to go back to the cabin, and that's when I saw the footprints. They weren't ours. They crisscrossed the road as if someone had danced there, and in the middle of the path, in the dust, was a ring of small stones placed like a careless crown. The stranger knelt, touched the stones, and smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Keep moving," he said to us. "That's all you can do." We walked faster. By the time we reached the porch, the house felt like a small island surrounded by something that hummed. The front door was shut. The keys were missing from where Luke had left them. Inside, the radio was playing, soft, the same static song from earlier. But underneath it, faint and layered, like someone humming under a blanket, were voices calling names we hadn't spoken. What followed was a night of mistakes stitched together by decisions that dominoed into terror. I won't give you every breath, just the parts that matter. The realization that whoever the wet man had been, he hadn't been alone. The discovery that the cabin door was now a puzzle we couldn't solve. The frantic plan to drive back to Cedar Hollow and get Miss June. The truck that wouldn't start. The lights that went out when we tried to use our phones. And the figure at the edge of the trees, watching. We ran because there is an animal in a human that knows when a place is taking more than it offers. We ran, and we were lucky. Bruises, a lost boot, a story that could be told. We left things behind, a cooler, a sketchbook, and later something I won't tell you because part of me still believes it might be listening. Now, years on, when I drive past mile markers, my hands go cold. I still have the photo Luke took that night, the one with the porch in shadow and a single small stone ring barely visible in the dirt. I keep it in a drawer I never open. People ask if it was ghosts, if it was something in the town, or if we imagined it because we wanted a story. I don't know. All I know is this. Some roads are invitations and some are warnings. That October night taught me that warnings are more polite than we give them credit for. Miss June didn't tell us to stay away to be cruel. She wanted to keep the peace of a place she knew could take more than it gave. We never went back. Luke hasn't spoken of it much. Scars show up in quiet ways. I took the long way home and vowed to stop collecting postcards. But sometimes, on a clear highway with the radio low, I picture that porch and the thin man smiling too wide in the light. I picture the ring of stones, patient and precise. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. Have you ever felt a road reach into your chest and squeeze, so silent, so hungry that every mile suddenly counted? I thought road trips were about music and gas stations. That night, the highway whispered something else, and I still wake to the sound of tires on gravel. My name is Lucas Bennett. I was 28 years old when it happened, July 14th, 2019. We set out because we were the kind of friends who believed any long ribbon of asphalt would fix whatever felt crooked in our lives. Evan Mitchell had the van, a battered white Ford with one working air conditioner and a cassette adapter he swore by. Sam Ortiz, who could fall asleep anywhere, came for the jokes and the roadside tacos. I was the planner. Routes, playlists, a paper map in case our phones decided to be traitors. We were heading from Dayton to a tiny lake town called Cedar Hollow. 3 days of nothing but windows and podcasts and the kind of conversations you only have when the world is kept at the distance of a taillight. We left at noon under an honest blue sky. Traffic dissolved as we left the interstate and took Route 87, a state highway with ditches deep enough for a horse and towns that still close their barbershops at 4. Along the way, we picked up the textures that make a trip feel real. A greasy spoon in Marlin County, where the waitress called everyone Hon. A thrift store where Sam bought an awful hat he wore with pride. A rest stop lined with the kind of pines that smell like old summers. We laughed at bad jokes, argued about whether the sunrise looked more orange or blood red, and made bets on which of us would run out of gas first. Character sketches matter because later you remember people the way you remember crossroads. Evan was a mechanic by trade and a coward by instinct. The combination meant he could fix anything but freeze when something truly unexpected happened. Sam was fearless in the ways that make you trust him on a cliff, but not in a moral quandary. He once ate a raw oyster in 30-degree weather because it felt right. I was the anchor, the one who called my mom from the highway if a sign looked unfamiliar. We joked that our trip soundtrack should be called Regret and Redemption. It sounded dramatic then. We talked plans, our voices falling into the rhythm of the road. We mapped out where we'd sleep, which scenic overlooks to stop at, and promised to stay off phones after dark. Old-fashioned, we said, like a pact. The map's paper smelled faintly of engine oil and coffee. Somewhere between town and the expanse of cornfields, Route 87 narrowed, and the cell phone bars dropped from full to timid slashes. That was when the world felt like it belonged only to us and the road. Before the main story, there are those small details that later get loaded with meaning. A billboard for Blackwater Hollow Antiques that showed a chipped porcelain doll, a stray dog that followed our van for a mile and then sat back on its haunches and watched us pass, the radio flicking to static for exactly 30 seconds at sunset. We notice these things and laugh them off. People do when they're traveling. You collect oddities like postcards. It makes you feel like you noticed something no one else did. We also argued, the normal low-stakes arguments of close friends. Evan wanted to make a detour through Redstone Ridge to see the overlook. Sam insisted we stop for fireworks in a town whose name none of us could agree on. And I argued for sticking to the plan because I was stubborn and liked the way plans made me feel safe. That stubbornness is a character trait I still blame for what came next. The decision to take the county road off Route 87 because it might shave an hour. And because Evan said he wanted to see the old bridge. The county road was a single lane, flanked by trees whose branches knitted into an almost continuous roof. Dusk came early there, the kind that hugs the land and makes shadows the same color as secrets. We passed a closed gas station with a flickering pump, and after a while the pavement became less road and more suggestion of where a road had been. The map, folded and creased, suggested a town called Blackwater Hollow lay ahead. It sounded like a place in a ghost story. We laughed again louder, trying to outpace the small, insistent dread that sits under every long drive when night approaches. The main story begins when the van's headlights catch something on the shoulder. A figure standing very still, one hand raised as if flagging us down. It should have been simple. Pull over, check, move on. Instead, everything tightened. I remember the cut of the light across the figure and the way Evan slowed but didn't stop. The figure was too thin, too straight, a silhouette in a jacket that caught the light like a note held too long at the end of a song. We didn't stop. We drove past, and for 20 heartbeats, all three of us convinced ourselves it was a hitchhiker. Then, at what felt like the precise point where we had all stopped believing in polite mysteries, a thump against the van, small, then another, like someone testing a door. Sam laughed at first, a thin, nervous sound, and said it was probably a branch. Evan muttered that the road was playing tricks. I rolled down my window and called, "Hey, you okay back there?" But the radio spat static, and the sound seemed to come from a very long place away. We pulled onto the shoulder because the map told us Blackwater Hollow had a diner, and we wanted coffee. The diner was smaller than I imagined, a low building with flaking paint and a neon sign that blinked open in the kind of cadence that suggests it was more habit than advertisement. No other cars were there. The air smelled of fryer oil and old vinyl. Behind the counter stood a man whose face could not make up its mind about kindness. He had a mora of cigarette smoke that lifted like a halo. He asked what we wanted with the same slow curiosity as someone who'd watched too many people pass through. We told him about the thumps. He squinted and told us that at night, on county roads, tires sometimes pick up pieces of whatever the road sheds, sticks, old metal, sometimes things that prefer not to be noticed. He said it like he was offering a local proverb more than a warning. Evan asked about the figure. The man's eyes flicked toward the window. "You must have seen the walker," he said. "Not a hitchhiker, not someone in distress. The walker." That word should have been ridiculous. In daylight, it would have been laughable. But outside the neon sign winked again, and the trees leaned closer like listeners. We left the diner and found a smear on the van's side. Not a scratch, not dirt, but something that looked like someone had pressed wet cloth to painted metal and then removed it in a hurry. Inside, a single hair, long, coarse, and unnaturally cold when I held it between two fingers. None of us remembered a person getting that close. After that, the road altered. We saw a set of headlights behind us and sped, and the lights matched our speed, then faded, then reappeared at the next curve. When we turned, the road felt unfamiliar, the map's lines stupid and inadequate. Our phones had no bars. Sam swore he saw the figure ahead, standing by the guardrail with its hand raised. It wasn't asking to be taken. It looked like it was counting us instead. The rest of that night is lodged in me in pictures. Evan's hands white on the wheel, Sam clambering out to check the tires under a sky that produced no stars over that stretch, the smell of exhaust and fried food that wouldn't leave. We tried to leave Blackwater Hollow behind, like a shirt we were done wearing, but the van kept pulling us back toward the county road, as if the asphalt had become a magnet. The walker, if that was what it was, appeared at odd places on the shoulder, never moving, always watching. When we stopped and left the van, there were footprints around us, but they led away from the parking lot into the trees, as if someone had vanished when the dark swallowed everything. At the worst moment, when the highway's hum turned to a near-silent pressure, Evan's engine died. It simply collapsed like a man who'd been pretending to work. We were stranded under a sky that felt like a lid. Sam wanted to walk for help. I wanted to stay with the van. Evan wanted to do both and kept saying, "This is a stupid joke," though his voice trembled. The diner man never came out. In the distance, perhaps in our minds, something moved between the trees, the kind of movement that argued with the natural rhythm of animal life. We made it out somehow, because people do when fear sharpens their focus. Morning found us on the interstate with a borrowed phone from a tow truck driver who found us as if he had been looking specifically for the lost. We told our story like people do when they hope telling will shrink the thing that happened. Friends laughed, saying nerves and moonlight and too many horror movies. But there were small evidences. The smear on the van that never came out, no matter how many times Evan scrubbed, the hair that Sam kept in a folded napkin for weeks, the way I sometimes pause at the sight of a shoulder when I drive alone. I still drive Route 87 sometimes, at daylight, and it looks ordinary. Farms, sleepy gas stations, the same ditches. But when dusk thickens and a lane narrows, I feel the road reach in again. Not because I'm sure the walker is waiting, I'm not, but because I know how quickly ordinary things can stitch themselves into stories that will follow you, like a passenger who never quite gets out. This story is over. Get ready for the next one.